Welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
Hello, welcome to a new episode of the Indian Ocean World podcast. My name is Archishman Choudhury, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Indian Ocean World Center, McGill University. Our guest today is Professor Annu Jalais, an anthropologist and an assistant professor at National University of Singapore. Professor Jalais researches on environmental anthropology, climate change and mental health, eco-psychiatry, and migration centered around the decolonization of the Indian subcontinent in 1947. Today, Professor Jalais will tell us about her research on the Sundarbans Delta, which is the largest delta in the world, sprawling across India and Bangladesh along the Bay of Bengal. Professor Jalais studied the Sundarbans for her doctoral thesis, which was published as a monograph in 2010 entitled Forest of Tigers, People, Politics, and Environment in the Sundarbans. Without much further ado, Professor Jalais, welcome to our podcast and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Dr. Choudhury. And thank you to the Indian Ocean World Center for having me.
So, if I may start off with a broad question, would you please briefly tell our listeners about your research? How did you develop an interest in studying the Sundarbans? I mean, what drove your curiosity to understand this deltaic region forested with mangroves and tigers and crocodiles, which sprawls across India and Bangladesh?
So I grew up in Kolkata, which is about 100 kilometers away from the Sundarban forest. And my parents actually worked in the region. I went to the Sundarban when I was 7. I went to a village on the island of Bashanti. I saw a few, venerations of Ma Bon Bibi, for example. I also came across Jishu Kirtan. I came across all kinds of stories about that area, not just forests, not just tigers, but also dacoits. In those days, it was very frightening because you heard all kinds of stories about dacoits coming to people's houses, but they only attacked rich people's houses. So, so these stories, and also I grew up in Shalkia, which is on the outskirts of Kolkata, in Howrah. And one of our neighbors, it was a very mixed neighborhood. One of our neighbors lived next to us, but actually was from the Sundarban and used to work there. So he used to also tell us a lot of stories. His children were about my age, and that's when really I got interested. And then as I grew up, I went as a high school student to the Sundarban on a nature study camp. What happened was in the late 80s, the government realized that people were getting, tigers in the Sundarban have always been known for being man-eaters. Even Bernier, okay, who went there in the 17th century, talks about the man-eating tigers of the Sundarban. And Bernier fears that he might be attacked because, the Lascars on his boat told him that the tiger would go for the fattest person. And, being this good Frenchman was the stoutest. And he writes about this in his books. So these tigers have always been known to be man-eaters. Humans are kind of seen as one of the tiger food that is available, and it's horrible to say so, but this is how it has always been understood. And a lot of scientists in the 80s were trying to understand why this was so. Some people said that perhaps because tigers mark their territory with their pee, with their urine. And so because of the fact that the tides wash off the contours of islands, the whole island is underwater, really, the forested islands during high tide. The tiger cannot really demarcate its territory and therefore swims everywhere. So this is one theory. Another theory is that they lack fresh water. And so they need human blood, human flesh for a sort of dietary balance. And this is why also the government in the 80s had started putting gur, jaggery, in the forest, and had started digging freshwater ponds for the tigers to sort of stop killing humans. And one of the ways in which they decided that they could perhaps protect people, because they noticed that the tiger would usually attack from the back and would turn the spinal cord. Okay, so it's a big blow at the back of the head, and the head is turned, the person dies instantly. So they started to distribute free masks to people in the villages, saying, hey, before entering the forest, just wear these masks, because the tiger will be confused and will not know where to attack, and therefore will not attack you. And I remember at that, I was in class 8 or something, and at that nature study camp, the scientists told us, well, these masks aren't working that well because people here are so superstitious. They all prefer going to the forest with a tiger charmer, and they prefer worshipping Ma Bon Bibi, and therefore they do not wear these masks. Or, and this is why the numbers of people killed, which was quite high in those days, is still as high. So I really was left with the question, why do these people refuse to wear masks? And what is this whole mask business? So this was something that stayed in my head. I went to the London School of Economics for a master's. At that point, and this was in the late 90s, Professor Philippe Descola from Paris was visiting, and he had just published his book in 1996 called The Spears of Twilight. I think it still was in French at that point. And he really was thinking along, how do we talk about the non-human? The language of Western modernity and Judeo-Christian tradition of animal restricts that creature to a particular identity. How do we go beyond that identity? How do we, for example, take into account people in the Amazon who think that the jaguar is related to them and that they can be jaguars and jaguars can be humans? And so a lot of this had interested me. And when I went to the Sundarban, people kept saying, Onu, if you want to write about us, you need to go to the forest. And at some point, I got a little impatient and I said, listen, because in those days, the only people who wrote about the Sundarban were biologists, zoologists, and actually mental health experts. But those were sort of the three categories. So I said, I'm not interested in your tigers. I'm not interested in the forest. I'm interested in you guys, in your history. And that's what I've come to write. And they kept saying, how will you write about us if you don't know our tigers? And I said, listen, I'm not a tourist. They said, you cannot write about us if you don't know our tigers. And so I said, what is so special about your tigers? Tell me more. What is it? And that's when, I was finally open to sort of listen to what they had to say about this creature that I had no idea about. And slowly, it started dawning on me that I should really try and understand this space in relation to the ways in which people speak about tigers here. It was a creature that was compassionate. And so, they sort of narrated a lot of their own stories through stories about tigers. So for example, they said, we are actually refugees. We are people that have come from the other side, have been brought here by the British, have fled from riots. But the tigers in the Sundarban have kind of had a similar fate. They have been hunted all across Southeast Asia, and they were on this long march trying to find a suitable home. And they were being, decimated and killed off everywhere. And finally, they came to this godforsaken place, and everybody left them alone. They were happy here. So when we started arriving, they understood what it meant to be refugees, to be unwanted creatures, and this is why we understand our tigers. And then the geography of this. So not only did they believe that they shared a certain history, but they said, the geography of this place has made us all similar kind of creatures. We are all cantankerous. This cantankerousness would come very, very often in conversations. It's the water, the air here. You can't help it. It's our tigers. Look, where do you find man-eating tigers anywhere in the world? This is the only place where you find, creatures that are so cantankerous, and we can't help it. It's just because of the kind of place we live in. So I had a lot of unanswered questions, and also, you sort of wonder who these people are, and the way they are depicted. I think it's the kind of final frontier for many kids growing up in Kolkata.
Thank you, Professor Jalais. It's a great story to hear. Before I move on to ask you a few more questions, I would just like to explain to our listeners. A dacoit is an Anglophone term of the Bengali word for burglary or robbery. It's dakati. From dakati, so in the British pronunciation, it became dacoity, and then it found its way to the dictionary or thesauruses as dacoits. So dacoit is just a burglar or a robber, if you'd so call it. Um, I had been reading some of your research while I had been preparing for this podcast, and I was struck by one of your arguments where you say that the Sundarban Islanders differentiate between new tigers and old tigers. So for them, the old tigers look at the islanders as brothers, and it's vice versa. But then you had interviewed a family who had lost a son to tiger attack, and they explained that it's not the old tigers, but it's the new tigers which kill humans. Would you please tell us about this genealogy? How does it start? Old tigers versus new tigers. Is this something related to colonization of these islands and clearing of the forest? I'm sort of trying to connect the dots here. Did that follow up in the post-colonial narrative of development and politics, which meant more forest clearing, the prawn collectors with their mosquito nets, and different forms of state intervention, including road construction, railway construction, and so on? Would you please tell us about how did this genealogy start? Sort of a distinction between old tigers and new tigers in the Sundarbans.
Thank you, Achishman. So the distinction really, for me, as I understand it, did not really come with colonialism, because this place was inhabited. For example, the island where I did field work was only inhabited about 100 years ago. So the whole southern part of, the inhabited region of the Sundarban, the region just above the forest, was cleared between 200 and 100 years ago. And people were brought in from different places, very often people who had debts to zamindars, people who came from Chotanagpur, people from all over, really, they were brought here to clear the forest. And we know that people in the Bengal Delta have always been moving. Okay, and a lot of them used to live on boats even. So people have been happy to find opportunities, and very often do. So it wasn't so much colonialism. What struck me, I was coming back one evening with a group of young men from a theater where we had seen a play. And this young man was saying, so what are you doing here? So I said, I've come to write about your history. And he says, Amra ki bagher khaddo na? Aren't we just tiger food? What brought this understanding that a lot of people in the Sundarban shared that they might just be tiger food? I came across the Morichapi massacre of 1979. So I was there in 99. So it had been 20 years that that massacre had happened. And in many conversations, people kept talking about that massacre. A lot of their relatives had come from Bangladesh and had been in Dondokarno in various camps all across central India, and had decided to come and settle there in the late 77, 78. So basically this is just before the left front government comes to power, and Jyoti Basu, who was then the opposition leader, had said that they would probably find a space for these udbastus, or homeless people from the other side of West Bengal, from the other side of Bengal, in the Sundarban. And they had also even talked about perhaps converting this. It was not a forested island, it was a revenue generating island, an island called Morichapi, where you had coconut and tamarisk plantation, so jhaugach, so you had these two kind of trees that had already been planted. The forest had been cleared. There was an embankment, and they had spoken about the probability of having the East Bengali refugees settle in that island. And so we don't know the exact numbers, but some people say 40,000, 50,000 people actually left various camps and traveled all the way to Morichapi to settle there. And for 2 years, this is what they did. They built schools, they built dispensaries, they built tube wells, they started basically organizing themselves. But in 79, there was brutal repression. Sunil Gangopadhyay wrote about it, but very few people. Jugantor had an article, but there isn't much work on that massacre and the number of people killed. So people in these various camps talked about caste and the fact that they were Namashudros, and this is the way they had been treated. In the Sundarban, the language wasn't as developed, and people kept saying that was the time when we realized that for the government, tigers are first class citizens and we are just second class citizens. We are just tiger food, because the government preferred to kick us out of this island, talking about that space being a World Heritage Site and a site that needed to, it was a tiger sanctuary, and that tigers needed to be protected. However, if you look at the geography, Morichapi is barely inside the forested islands. So it sort of could have worked. But it was for a lot of people a huge betrayal. And I felt that the islanders felt that this was a betrayal because a lot of their families had come and settled there. So younger people from the islands had gone to Morichapi and had helped the Udbastus from central India to come and settle and make the most of this space. So for me, really, the old tiger versus the new tiger discourse starts from then, from 79, when for them there was a betrayal from the state. And they said, it was from then on that the government started to produce tigers in labs. The new tigers were killing machines. They wouldn't listen to our tiger charmers' charms, to the mantras we used to say. So it was a very, it was sort of a kind of order that had been broken because of state violence. And some people try to rationalize this and say, I don't really believe in the whole tiger charmer thing. I don't believe that these tigers were any more, you know, uh, prone to listening to us than the new tigers or whatever. It is just that in 79 there were so many dead bodies of people who not only died shot by the police because the police encircled the island and shot at them, but also perhaps because they died of cholera, dysentery, not being able to avail of fresh water, which they would go and get from the other islands around Morichapi. So because of all these things, you had all these dead bodies that were washed along the islands, the forested islands, and tigers got a taste for human flesh. And so this is also why they became, so we, I don't really know. What I'm just reporting is the way in which the islanders kind of see something as a huge big betrayal, a time after which they started seeing themselves as subaltern people, people who were not very important for the state. But the kind of friendship and the kind of complicity that existed with tigers was broken, with the state suddenly seeing them as superior creatures. And I found that very interesting, right?
Oh, well, thank you, Professor Jalai. For our listeners who are not familiar with what is Morichapi, we will include a link to the developments that had unfolded in Morichapi in 1979 with our podcast. And I would like to now turn towards the bigger elephant in the room, if I may so call it, which is about your research on mental illness in the Sundarbans in the context of climate change. You've argued in your articles that unnatural deaths keep on shattering families across the Sundarbans, either it be killings by tigers or crocodiles or snakes, or even the most bizarre of them all, when some people appear to have died after contracting fear, which they may have, which might be the result of having been in close encounter with an animal. You sort of make this point that it's more like mental illness that is caused by disaster fatigue, because this is not just due to the harshness of the environment where the islanders have to survive for their livelihood, but it's also related to the ever shifting river embankments and cyclones that keep on hitting these islands every few years, after which everything has to be built, sort of rebuilt from scratch. Would you please explain this phenomenon between climate change and mental illness to our listeners?
One could say that the effects of climate change in the Sundarban are perhaps the oldest in the world. So, for example, the tilting of the Bengal Delta basin, right, towards the east, which caused the western part to increasingly have brackish water. So a lot of people are saying that this might be the reason why the you know the islands which are today inhabited in the Sundarban and which might have been inhabited in the 14th, 15th century weren't inhabited anymore in the 17th, 18th centuries, 19th century, okay, when the British came, because of the fact that this western portion of the Sundarban became a lot more brackish than the eastern portion. So as I was telling you, when I started doing field work, a little more than 20 years ago, the only people who had written about the place, apart from the natural scientists, were people like Michael Weiss and Aurobindo Chaudhuri, Dr. Aurobindo Chaudhuri, who had written about mental health in the Sundarban and how it was affecting people, and how there were more people suffering from mental health issues in the Sundarban region than anywhere else in Bengal. And this has been, as you call it, the disaster fatigue, or this is a place where people have constantly had to cohabit with cyclones, with losing everything from one day to the next, with with really knowing that they are the worst off. Okay, which is why if anybody makes any money in the Sundarban, the first thing they do is to buy a plot of land outside the Sundarban region. Okay, so Goria has become the new in place, or Shonarpur, is full of people who were either school teachers in the Sundarban, therefore made some money, or even people who were boat owners, and therefore made a lot of money. They still prefer their kids to work a factory worker, or a person who owns a little tea shop, rather than risk continuing to be a boatman. So when some of these people are my friends, so I keep asking them, why would you prefer your son to be living in this hovel in in the outskirts of Kolkata, rather than living the what seems to be the good life? And he's like, Onu, you do not understand. We have no good schools here. There are no hospitals. There is so much insecurity. um, you know, Forest officials come and help themselves to any fish that we might have caught. Dacoits come and try to loot us. In the Sundarban, if you are seen as doing better than your neighbors, your ponds are poisoned. Basically, there is really this ethos of, we are in this together. So you live here, you're like everybody else. You do better, you get out. Otherwise, you can't stay. So this is a place which is, at least which was, not as safe as other places. So one of the things people have done is to leave the place. But I suppose for those who stay on, the fact that you are having to risk your life going into the forest, the fact that you're having to risk your loved ones' lives into the forest. And as a woman, it's not as if it's only your husband risking his life in the forest. You yourself are going to try and catch the tiger prawn spawn in, along the rivers, and perhaps get attacked by a shark and lose a limb, or get killed by a crocodile. So there is this constant fear. And if it's not that, you have cyclones, right? You have cyclones twice a year, around April, May, and around October, November. These are the two during, just before the monsoon and just after. So in a way, one can understand why it would affect people mentally. And this is not something that I had done when I was doing field work. So I was doing house-to-house surveys in this village, and I wanted to know how many people had been killed by tigers in those days, because one never knew the true figures. If you had gone into the forest without a valid permit, people would know how your husband usually had died, but you would just tell people that they had had dysentery, because if you were caught by government officials, or if it was known that he had been killed in the forest by a tiger, you would have to pay a fine. Okay, a huge fine, because he had gone into the forest without a valid entry permit. So I wanted to know the true figures, and the only way one could do that is to do a house-to-house survey, of the village where I was living. And so I wanted to not, ask directly. So I said, did anybody die unnaturally? Because I had heard of suicides and I had heard of fear. So, and then I realized that there were as many cases of suicide as there had been of people getting killed by tigers. So in those days, in a population of 2,000, there had been 25 people in the last 25 years killed of tigers, and about 25 or 30 killed of suicide. And a lot of people had died of fear. So people said, unnaturally, do you mean fear? then they would say, okay, he went to the forest, he saw the tiger, and 2 months later he was dead. Or he heard things at night, when he was in the forest, and after that he wasn't normal anymore, and 6 months later he died. And so if ever you had had a nightmare, or you complained to anyone that you had been frightened, the Ojha would be called to sort of remove that fear from you. And it happened to me once. I just told the woman in whose house I lived that I had had these horrible nightmares. And before I knew it, she had called 3 different Ojhas and taken me to a woman who used to have a little temple for me to be for exorcists to sort of remove whatever was causing me distress, right? So I was stunned to see the rapidity at which they came and did that. And then I started noticing, for example, my neighbor was very worried because his 7-year-old daughter had seen a snake and had fever after that. And again, she was exorcised so that the fear is removed. So the fact that fear kills became something that I got interested in. I have just written this small chapter, but I am at the moment trying to explore that and see to what extent, it is. So this is why there's this term by Man Barua called ecopsychiatry, where people are trying to look at how your environment basically causes a certain fear, a certain distress of your living conditions. But so this is what I'm now interested in this eco-psychiatry. And what I have also been noticing in the last 20 years is that the village where I did fieldwork is not as populated as it used to be. And in 20 years, you've had a lot of births. And I realized that people had left. A lot of people have left. So I think that really, just as 20 years ago, one could link it up to climate change and to the effects of the environment on people's mental health. One really should be looking at that connection and talking about it a lot more. So migration, people having to leave, people having to live in very different circumstances in completely alien spaces, very often in slums. You also are moving with the discrimination of caste, which, as I said, when you live in a space which is 95 to 99% SC/ST, you are not really discriminated against on caste grounds. But once you leave that space and suddenly your name of Malo or Mondol at once marks you as a specific kind of person, and you have to face the discrimination of others. And I know that some of them, for example, had done very well and had, by affidavit, changed their surnames to a respectable caste name because they did not want to face the kind of discrimination, that a name like Mal would have had in the context of Kolkata. So basically, I want to connect migration, climate change, mental health, and look at how all of this kind of feeds into each other, because I think it is, this is what is creating a lot of trauma, a lot of stress.
Thank you, Professor Jalais. Just to explain to our listeners, the words SC and ST, they respectively mean scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in the context of India. And usually there is a lot of literature on reservation for these particular categories in terms of jobs and education. Before I move on, we would provide a list of Professor Jalais' publications on these different themes that she has spoken about today. Do look it up if you want to follow and read her fascinating research. Last year, a severe cyclone, Amphan, hit the Sundarbans during a raging COVID-19 pandemic. I would just like to know if you could provide us with any insights on how COVID-19 and Amphan have had impact on mental health in the Sundarbans.
I think it has added to the stress, at least initially, But in the Sundarban, as well as in Bangladesh, what I have increasingly heard people say is that COVID is a rich person's disease, because they haven't seen the kind of deaths that they were expecting when people first talked about COVID in the village areas. So if I have lost friends in Kolkata, I have lost nobody from rural Bengal due to COVID. So basically, there is, the fact that they do not have comorbidities, the fact that they do not have a high BP, living outside, not in enclosed AC spaces, all of this, points to the fact that they have one of the lowest mortality rates, whether it's Bangladesh or the kind of rural areas. So more work needs to be done on this. But this is something that has surprised the experts. But what I would like to end with is that really we need to be giving a lot more thought to our lifestyles and the way we live, because these cyclones are going to increase. And what are the ways in which we all over the world, can make certain choices that are going to perhaps affect less to those who have never had any impact on the carbon levels of our environment. I think that COVID and Amphan, cyclones like Amphan, before that you had Bulbul, you had Sidr, you had Ayla. So these are going to increase. The waters are warming up all across the Indian Ocean, and cyclones are going to become routine. This is what is predicted. And also what is predicted is that we're going to have more and more of these, COVID type diseases.
Thank you, Professor Jalais. Just to close off our proceedings for the day, may I now ask you a final question uh, on how to combat the effects of climate change in the Sundarbans, which you have argued resemble floating saucers in the ocean. What exactly is the way ahead, and how do you feel as an anthropologist we should tackle this problem?
I feel really despondent. I think that after reading The Great Derangement by Amitav Ghosh, there is nothing much we can do but kind of be attentive to what some of the most environmentally friendly communities have to say about cohabiting with the natural world. One of the ways in which personally I have tried to do something is by joining the Dakshin Foundation in southern India. So they do amazing work with coastal communities, and together with Arati Sridhar from the Dakshin Foundation, we applied for an SSRC grant on the Indian Ocean. And we are looking at the effects of climate change and migration on communities, coastal communities located all across countries in the northern Indian Ocean. So this is one of the ways I feel we can do something. It is to really remain attentive to what people have to say, and I think reparations. I think increasingly we will have to think of how richer countries can give reparations to poorer countries that are suffering the effects of climate breakdown without really having contributed towards that. Some people are going to die. Delhi, for example, Delhi's population and the population around Delhi are losing 10 years of their lives because of the kind of pollution that people have to breathe in. So, greater mindfulness at an individual level on what we eat, what we think is important in our lives, the choices we make.
Thank you, Professor Jalais. I'm sure our listeners are going to love this wonderful podcast where you took us on an amazing journey through the Sundarbans, connecting all the different themes, the relationship between humans, non humans, and contemporary serious issues like climate change and pandemics. That's all we have got time for today. Thank you once again, Professor Annu Jalais, and thank you also to my colleague Rennie Mandeville, who worked behind the scenes and will help us producing and preparing this podcast for circulation in a few weeks' time. That's all for today. Until then, goodbye and keep listening to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
The Indian Ocean World podcast would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This podcast series is part of the SSHRC-funded partnership project Appraising Risk, Past and Present, interrogating historical data to enhance understanding of environmental crises in the Indian Ocean world.